Well, hello there. Okay. Yeah. So, let me get into see where we are here. Hello, Tote and Meandering. Boy, I slept last night like, hello, Fox Dre. I slept last night in a way, I mean, I slept so much longer. Apparently, I set my alarm and I slept 6 hours past my alarm. I never heard it. I woke up and my kitchen light was on, which means I either left it on, which I don't think I would have noticed that because it was dark kind of when I went to sleep. Just I woke up quite hello, Madfinger. Quite disoriented. I've never slept through an alarm before. So I was out last night. I don't know what led to that. But man. And my CBD paste is a day behind. It was supposed to arrive today. Apparently it will arrive tomorrow. Fortunately, I saved myself one last dose. Because a day without CBD is, without my CBD paste is, well, let's say a night without it is not a night that I really like to experience. It really, that's at MyNutra, by the way. I'm a quick little promo, mynutra.com, CBD hemp paste. The finest way to get cannabidiol and all of the entourage and synergistic effects in there. Highly recommended over any of the CBD extracted oils. So that's that. Yeah, well, boy, it was certainly a good sleep. I don't, seemed to be dream rich, but I was so under. Trying to have any kind of recall is close to undoable, but that's okay. Been looking forward to this live stream as opposed to the last couple of weeks where there was a certain amount of trepidation, but last week's, I would say the chat was very helpful in just making me realize that these transmissions have a purpose. And I got a delightful email from a person who will remain unnamed, but was deemed by the person too long for the comment section, and so I got an email, and I'm really glad that it was in an email. It was really, really well received. And also further made me feel that what I'm attempting to do here, what I'm doing, and what fruit is supposed to come from that, from the telestic transmissions, at least I got some concept that I'm providing a service and or at least some nourishment. Hello, expanding the process. I noticed that certainly some viewership, less viewership. I don't know if that's YouTube and its algorithms, whatever, but it is what it is also. Certainly not inspiring me to make any course changes, that's for sure. So I definitely have some notes, but I'm just gonna kind of warm myself up a little bit. Let the candle and the incense kind of fill the air with that spirit. And it was interesting. Dark Journalist did a double, a Friday and a Saturday night presentation, kind of focusing a bit on Atlantis. And I guess it was Friday. He kind of covered Edgar Cayce's take, material on Atlantis, and how much of that material has not been released by the ARE or the Association, what Enlightenment. I forget what ARE stands for. It's the Edgar Cayce Foundation. Research and Enlightenment. I guess it's the Association for Research and Enlightenment. And how a lot of the stuff was kind of like so out there, it's never really been released. And then on Saturday, he covered Rudolf Steiner's writings on Atlantis. And it's interesting to hear these other streams that tie into the narrative of our story. I'm not going to say history, because history is their story. It is the story of the conquerors. History is the patriarchal narrative. It's quite misleading. And what's interesting is the other thing is when I listen to material coming from somebody like Edgar Cayce, somebody who kind of certainly brought more metaphysical data into his narrative, but he's still coming from an esoteric biblical narrative. And the biblical narrative is a form of history. And I hope that subtlety is understood, just based on what I said, that history is a patriarchal narrative. Our story, and at the personal level, is my story, which are the mysteries. But the thing is, many of the mystery schools Dark Journalist is covering are patriarchal mystery schools. They're kind of the mystery schools that developed after the original mystery schools were basically destroyed and driven so deep underground that even they started becoming incoherent. A good case of the incoherency of the original mysteries and how beat up they got is the Nag Hammadi texts. I mean, the Nag Hammadi texts are certainly based on the Sophianic narrative, but there's barely a paper in there that has the narrative in any kind of clear formation without it being taken on patriarchal detours. Basically, archontic detours. The whole patriarchal movement is an archontic demiurgic movement. Hello, Nish. And that's what makes that's why I wrote today, the cosmology matters, because when you can listen to data streams, knowing who you are in the cosmic narrative, then you can actually still pick some nuggets out of our story, the mystery, my story, and you can even see sometimes where they zigged when they should have zagged, or basically when they left the original narrative. Narratives, especially the written ones, are spells. Now, spoken is a spell too, and it's what kind of spell do you want to be under? The spell of the dreaming, or the spell of the invasion of the dreaming? And so that's what's interesting, because I really love the job that Daniel, the Dark Journalist, is doing with his material. He's done enormous research. He brings in his own being into understanding it. And I really wonder down the road what might unfold from this. It's a very thorough investigation, And a lot of times, the beginning parts of investigation are all about the clues, and then assembling the scenes. Hello, soul traveler. John Lamb Lash, and a lot of times, when he says, all the clues, about examining the crimes of history. And again, history is the patriarchal narrative. All the clues in the world are useless unless you know the crime that has been committed. And from my perspective, many of the narratives, especially the patriarchal narratives, are a crime. They're a planting of the smallpox blankets into the native knowledge, the native gnosis. And then, of course, from all of that confusion, we get the birth of the New Age. And things like whether or not the moon is real and whether or not it's got a good or a bad influence. Interestingly, apparently one of the people who inserted that the moon was not a good influence, it didn't get into the organic nature of it, was Gurdjieff. Gurdjieff was a very manly man. So it's not very surprising to me that a manly man might have misunderstandings with the energy of the moon. Matter of fact, all the detractors of the moon, I forget there's another second one, his name, I don't even know if I ever knew it, but the detractors of the moon have been men. Now, of course, in the Sophianic narrative, we have the trimorphic protonoia, and it's based on that the organic system of the Earth is the moon, the sun, and the Earth. And the other planets, at least 7 of the other planets, are archontic creations, duplications, mimicry of other solar systems, to hold the consciousness of the demiurge and his angelic mafia. The other thing about narratives is whether or not they lead you into deep ecology or away from ecology, away from either where you understand your place in the ecosystem, your exquisite place within the ecosystem, your emergence from that ecosystem, your dependence on that ecosystem, the relation, like a brother or sister, a family relationship to that ecosystem, and narratives that drop that out. And the only narratives that keep the ecology in place, besides the Sophianic narrative, are other indigenous narratives, like the Native American narratives, like the original people of Australia. The Aborigines is their proper name, not the Aborigines, because as we've discussed, Ab means away from original. So deep ecology, our place within the ecosystem, as a product of that ecosystem, as a relation of that ecosystem, is really crucial. The destruction of the planet and the destruction of its ecosystems are being done by the human species, is being done by the human species. but the human species itself is not leading this destruction. It's certainly supporting it through being unengaged in the processes, and also being spellbound by narratives that do not take ecology to their heart. The ecology is kind of like a setting for their narrative, as opposed to the part of the narrative itself. I noticed that right now there's 9 people watching, so I must be doing a good job, because apparently I'm boring the shit out of people. And that's kind of, I just have to whether I'm not going to stay on track or go for entertainment value. And if what I have to say is entertaining, that's good, and if not, so be it. And then there's, again, talking about hello, Tamu. And then there's kind of the narratives, the cosmology that we come from, and how it's based. Now, one of the things that's coming to a head, even though it's not well elucidated, is the complaint with patriarchy, especially by women. And it's certainly an excellent point. But what is the background that it's coming from? And thank you, Foxtrot and Tote. And so when I think about women and their issues with the patriarchy, I wonder what is the cosmology of many women. Because when it comes to cosmologies, men and women are not much different. They kind of usually, in the Western world, you've grown up in one or two patriarchal visions. One is the Bible, and the other is Darwin. So if you grew up in kind of like an observant family, or even one that went to church, there's a chance that the biblical narrative is a part of your cosmology. If you grew up in an atheist family, there's a good part that the Darwinian narrative is part of your cosmology. 2 patriarchal narratives. So I feel that in many ways, one of the things that women have to get is you're not going to get out of the patriarchy while, as a group, the cosmology of patriarchy is upheld. You cannot expect balance from a patriarchal narrative. And even, and that's why one of the reasons why I've kind of, what is pagan? Again, the word pagan came from the Romans themselves before they were Christian. Their temple worship was not paganism, although the monotheisms would conflate that. But the people who invented the word pagan use it very specifically, and that was the rural, earth-worshipping country people, the ones who didn't have a formal religion. Socrates was sentenced to death for questioning the gods. Pagan people did not have death penalties for questioning nature, because nobody really questioned nature. It wasn't a dogma. The Greek and Roman pantheons had dogmas. They were also patriarch-led because they were transitional. This is when the patriarch had taken primacy, but was still including the feminine. but it was that was in that process of diminishment. And part of us knowing that it was part of the diminishment was the way that the pantheon people, what Christians would call pagan Romans, actually when they said pagan were referring to the earth worshipping rural country folk. So a big part of us finding balance between genders and getting rid of this rancid, muscular, intellectually bent, brutal patriarchy is understanding that you're not going to get rid of a patriarchy while you still play with patriarchal narratives. It can't be done. Your whole being is rooted in a patriarchal narrative, or our. And the toxic patriarchy is not how men would have naturally developed. There's a bunch of misguided, weapon-clad alpha males inserting themselves, bringing a narrative, inserting it into the natural narratives, and basically by arms, by force, little by little took over the world. Not the earth, but the world. And the earth is being degraded by that world. I like that meandering. It's like trying to lift a bucket you're standing in. That is so well put. And so again, to me, there's a very real shouting going on about patriarchy, especially from out of the mouths of women. And I support that, but I don't support being clueless in creation about the shouting. For women to really get rid of the patriarchy, you're going to have to get rid of the patriarchal narratives, the cosmology. How did you get on this? How did we all get on the planet? And men and women ask themselves the same question, and they don't get separate answers, because it applies to us equally. I mean, as a spirits, we're androgynous. I was last night, something came to me about birthing. Now, when it comes to, hello, Callan, when it comes to having, biological children, the birth process is exclusive to women. One of the reasons women held the center spot in the ancient world. But when it comes to the human species and their imagination, and the fruits of those imagination showing up, of the intellect and imagination showing up in the world, that's where our androgyny shows up, because men and women can equally birth ideas and concepts. And in the way that it was done, it's an emanation. We call it birthing, but it's the emanation of that from the unmanifest into the manifest. So that that androgyny of spirit, means that obviously there is a narrative that is closer or on the truth, and narratives that are away from the truth. And so let's see if I can get with Dark Journalist. So anyway, yeah. So Dark Journalist, he's bringing forth these works by Edgar Cayce, who never dropped his Christianity. Steiner kind of maintained a little bit of what I would call an esoteric Christian perspective. And so that kind of clouds their understanding of the mysteries, because they've had a little bit of the virus deposited into their imagination. And like any virus that is allowed to thrive within the body, it will then insert its DNA into the native DNA and propagate. So when the imagination gets used, it will on occasion propagate viral narratives, virus narratives. This by no means indicates that what's in that information does not have utility. It just is a matter of one needs to know which nits to comb out of that narrative. In case you don't know, a nit is the egg of a louse. So it's been interesting listening, and then of course there's been some pretty deep exposition on the origines of Australia, detailing their encounters from beings from Pleiades, and then you have the Dogon in Mali, Africa, who are dealing with beings from the Sirius constellation. Once again, these are all constellations within our galaxy, and the Sophianic narrative is a galactic story, is a story of our galaxy, with the intelligences that dwell. Some people would refer to them as the gods, but they're the intelligences, the qualities of the originator, that the originator being the unmanifest, the aeons being the qualities that were manifested into the, a tactile and energetic reality. So I find although for some people, these other stories, including the Anunnaki story, including the biblical narrative, they can be rabbit holes and that lead to cesspools if one does not have the native cosmology to proceed from and understand these other interactions. Some of them I see in a way almost supported by our Divine Mother, and others that I see as absolutely anathema. And also in each case, the beauty of, let's say, the Dogon and the origines of Australia is that, first of all, they posit that the Anthropos was already here on the earth, which is part of the Sophianic narrative. The Anthropos is the creation of Sophia and Thelete, of course with the input of the other aeons, but they were kind of the design ones. And it's interesting that some meditations I've done on the process that, according to the Gnostic intel, according to the Sophianic narrative, Sophia was one of the later emanations. In other words, so that would make her one of the younger aeons. And that makes not only complete sense, but I could say I got some confirmation by journeying on that question. Because as the originator was emanating newer qualities into the galaxy, and each galaxy has its own galactic core, although my sense is it's a common intelligence behind these unique spots. And that intelligence might be what we in Gnostic terms call the originator, although when we speak about the originator in the Sophianic narrative, we're speaking about the originator of this galaxy. But even when one gets into the electric universe and some of the Paul Stamets and his mycological study, and he's showing how microrhizums put out this net, and then he showed a picture of like from the Hubble telescope or certain telescopes, they're able to show all the dark matter, and you see the same morphology. So when one sees the same morphology at the microscopic level on the Earth, and the same morphology in what we call space, you realize that there is a common designer. But getting to the age of the fact that Sophia has been deemed one of the younger, if not the youngest, but certainly one of the younger aeons, makes sense in the progression of an originator putting its qualities out into the phenomenal world, we'll say, the phenomenal reality, and then realizing at a certain point that or maybe just from experience of being within those things, that what was missing and what needed to be added, what needed to be emanated to the pleroma, was wisdom. And that's one of the things I think is important to never lose when we use a term like Sophia as almost like a proper name. Is the word means wisdom. Sophia is the quality, the essence of the emanated wisdom from the originator. So there is great reason, or logic, and so it fits into a gnosis, that as the pleroma was developing at one point, and maybe just from the experience of going from the unmanifest into the manifest, and then at one point enough feedback that forms a body of wisdom. And when that wisdom was formed is when Sophia was emanated. Wisdom. Sophia means wisdom. Wisdom was emanated. And this wisdom has agency. Again, the aeons have autonomy. They embody qualities of the originator, but have their own existence. So in the beauty of both the Dogon stories, and in many ways they're not really, that we're not talking about their creation myths, because the Dogon story picks up with the Dogon already being created. The Australian origine story of interacting with beings from the Pleiades are about an anthropos already on the Earth. The Syrians that interacted with the Dogon ancestors were dealing with a people that were already manifest. They were dealing with the anthropos. And hidden in both the Sumerian and biblical narratives is more than ample. It's a little bit in the Bible. It's blatant. In the biblical narrative, the fact that there were already anthropines on the planet is blatant. When Cain, in the biblical narrative, is going to be cast out of Eden, And he's concerned about how all the people out there, that he was concerned they would kill him. Who are these people? Those people were the anthropos. The original people. And then in the way Zecharia Sitchin is got to be the absolute worst way to pick up the Anunnaki narrative, but it was in many ways it was the best way because nobody heard of it until him. So, all right, credit for putting that on the map, but it's Anton Parks and other translators, but Anton Parks has been the best. And I have his book Eden, and again, and in there they were talking about the Anunnaki prior to the creation of whatever they cobbled together, and their gardens, and how their gardens were being raided by the humans. You know, by these anthropine species, and how these anthropine species, by bringing in all of the native organisms from the forests, killed their pristine gardens. And they had to replant. And there's, translations of the goddesses of the Sumerian pantheon who were doing the garden, praying to the earth that she might bring forth new seedlings. So when we look at deeper expositions on the Sumerian and Anunnaki myths, we find ample evidence of a human species on the planet. We also find evidence that the goddesses of the Anunnaki pantheon were aware of a Mother Earth that they appealed to when they did their second garden planting. Prayed to her, appealed to her, for her to to insert her life-giving energies into the second endeavor of theirs. Oh, Fox or Dre, I'm getting to that. That's actually that's to me part of what's important about the fact that there were 9 anthropic seedings. And that's what, to me, what ties into the Syrian and Pleiadian interactions with Earth Anthropos. I mean, in fact, I'll jump right into that since you got there. So on the Earth was Anthropos 10. The work of trying to insert corrections. Anthropos 10 was a correction. Because remember, one of the big things we want to talk, there's error and correction. And when there's an error, you insert corrections. You go about correcting. So Anthropos 10 was, you could call it an upgrade, but that upgrade correctly would be called correction. And so when we have scenarios like the Dogon and the Aborigines of Australia, we're talking about Anthropos 10 beings, species. When we have visits, whether it's from the Pleiades in the Origine story, or Sirius in the Dogon story, and if these, and in the case of the Australian Origine story, these were humanoids. There wasn't like some kind of humanoid amphibious being, which is a kind of like, or fish-like being, or water-loving being, in the case of the Nomo and the Dogon. The Nomo being that being. In the case of the Origine story, we have basically a humanoid species, perhaps different stature, perhaps different type of skull, but it's an anthropine. Anthropos 9. And what kind of unveils in the story of the Australian Origines is that the Pleiadians suggest a pairing of their genomes that that they both might benefit. So for me, what in this scenario, what the Pleiadians were looking at was some upgrade. It's like they knew that this new Anthropos had qualities that they did not. But being a further along, quote unquote, like a development path, I don't want to call it an evolutionary path, but we could, but a development path, they had some millions of years, especially towards technology. So in many ways, a contract between the two anthropines, 9 and 10, was agreed to. That Anthropos 10, or the Earth Anthropos, would produce offspring, and there's a kind of an exchange. And in many ways, it was, I think, in many ways, it looks like the Pleiadians said, "Well, we have technology, and you have new genetic material." Or can we call that a trade? And apparently, the Origine said, "Deal," and the deal was struck. See, and what I like, the reason I can interpret this, because this does not disturb the Sophianic narrative as told in the terma of Gaia awakening. Our creation is still our creation. These are extra things. And, but they can be distracting. I feel one of the things is, like, the Sophianic narrative needs to be taken in full, and where you are, that is your living mythos. And then when you turn into these other to these other stories, you go, "How?" And then you say, "Oh, this fits in, no problem." It doesn't change a word of the narrative, but this is further part of our story. Kind of like extra. But extras sometimes can be distractions. And then the Origines further go on to say that they embraced the technology of the Pleiadians and found that it was not superior to the technology they had of communicating with nature. That basically they already had all the skills they needed to live on beautifully on this earth, and that in many ways the technology was taking them away from that sacred relationship. Which is why when the Europeans go there, they found what they called a backward people, not realizing that these people in their history had already embraced the technology far in advance of the technology that showed up with the Europeans, and had rejected it aeons ago, or ages ago. This is their own story. And there's somebody who's doing a great job. He's from Australia. I guess he's got half Origine blood. I wish I could remember his name right now. I watched. The interesting thing is, I'll find somebody, and then I'll watch hours of the material, and then I realize that after about 2 of their material things, that basically they're giving the same talk over and over, especially if it's a recent one. So they have all their latest research, and if I find 5 different presentations, it's 5 presentations of the same material. So and many times I realized I only needed to watch 2 to realize that there was really only one current one, the freshest one, the updated one. And there's some really fascinating information coming out of Australia, including what looks to be like an Egyptian connection, but that's provided that the culture we're calling Egyptian was in fact Egyptian culture, if not something else that we call Egyptian. Same kinds of iconography, hieroglyphs, all that. So again, when we have the Sophianic narrative that posits that we were created, we were designed by Sophia and Telestic, by wisdom and intent. The qualities are important rather than the names, in my opinion, to understand the wisdom of the collective aeons, which are really the externalized, the part of agency, the agency within the cosmos of the mysterious originator. And again, this originator should be considered, of course, many people posit, and even though we get into the Tolkien cosmology, which was not, the Silmarillion is not fiction per se, as it was Tolkien, from his own Christian perspective, tuning in to a cosmic narrative that is, the Silmarillion and the Valar is so, there's a lot of parallel there with the Sophianic narrative. Once again, you have to understand that the person receiving, who kind of made these very shamanic journeys, but more like journeys into fairy, that would be F-A-E-R-I-E, and him getting information, data. But again, this is a man who stayed Catholic all his life. So once again, we have people who are going into kind of, either fairy, Akashic records, if you want to call that, and coming back with material, but of course that they have all, with these three people, Tolkien, Casey, and Steiner, each one of them is interpreting its material while still holding on to the some form of the biblical narrative mind virus. And how that virus will create distortions. One of the reasons I'm doing as a telestic transmission, one of the reasons I'm kind of going off what might seem of tangents of the Sophianic narrative, is I think I have found the language that upholds the Sophianic narrative, that allows some of these other narratives to find their place within the narrative, and understand why that narrative has to be so preciously guarded. The term of Gaia Awakening, terma means treasure, or uncovered treasure. Yes, Tolkien was very close to nature. And he was very opposed to governments, or gooberments as I call them. And I think that also by kind of exposing that in each of the cases, whether it's the Origine story, the Australian Origine story, the Dogon and their Nomos story, the biblical narrative, or the again, not the Sitchin Sumerian narrative, but like, real scholars like Anton Parks and what they bring forth. In every instance, the Anthropos was already on the earth. So what does that mean? Again, once again, Cain was concerned about going out, and he even went and found a wife, supposedly in the land of Nod. So Cain goes out and finds an Anthropine wife. He was not an Anthropine. The Pleiadians, which represent Anthropos 9, in my opinion, negotiate a deal with Anthropos 10 on the Earth. The Anunnaki were having a hell of a time trying to put whatever kind of colony they were doing, wherever they come from, whether it's Atlantis or off-planet. I think Atlantis is a strong suggestion, because they had Vimana-type craft, so they could have come out of the sky. So those who came out of the sky. It didn't say those who came from interstellar. It says they came out of the sky. So in each of these cases, the Sophianic narrative, which posits that the creation story was done by Sophia and Thelete, and after she formed into the Earth, and through a kind of like almost like a wormholing, and like a plasmic wormholing, so that the new genome could be inserted onto the Earth. My understanding, based on my own journeying, is the original seedings were almost like a puffing out from the original galactic center of this panspermia that held the seeds of building life into it. And it was from that initial seeding that the Anthropos had gotten up to 9, and it was after the formation of the Earth that, to get the new upgrade, there was a specific plasmic tubing, almost like, so that the Pleroma could inject the Anthropos 10 genome onto Earth. So you can see a setup for other Anthropos 9 beings finding out, because they've been around, and being aware that there was an upgrade to the Anthropine genome, and they wanted in on it. Totally understandable. One could even understand the Pleroma, which would have been the focus for all the other Anthropines, as opposed to us having a local aspect of the Pleroma with us, which gives us local agency. One can almost see like shamans of Anthropos 9 getting inclinations from the Pleroma of what had transpired in our solar system, specifically on Earth. And then, in fact, because of there was Anthropos 10 being later in the galactic story, the galactic unfolding, that there could be mutual benefit. In other words, there could be some technologies, some developed intellect that could actually help the Anthropos 10, being latecomers to the Anthropine mix of things in the galaxy, that you can see that I can see at least some nudging from the galactic center. Let's move around. There's mutual benefit from Anthropos 9 meeting Anthropos 10. Foxadre, before I got exposed to the Sophianic narrative, it looked to me like Tolkien was drawing from European paganism, and I think that in crafting some of his aeons, the Valar, there was some influence there. But from what I can tell, after taking on and going into the Sophianic narrative, I saw such parallels as far as a creation story that is not like the pagan myths as much. That I find that in a Tolkien Silmarillion, not the Lord of the Rings, the Ainu Lindale, Ainu or the Ainur, who would be the aeons. I mean, Ainur, aeon. I mean, you know, that's so close to the same word. And then when the Ainur left the pleroma, which would be kind of like the scenario where Iluvatar and the Ainur sing the creation song. And then there were certain of the Ainur who were going to go into the earth realm, Arda, that they became the Valar, but basically what they were is Ainur who took on bodies or some kind of form, and that changed them. And so the designation between kind of like pleromic aeons, or the Ainur, and then the aeons who came into manifestation, very much like Sophia, were the Valar. So there, to me, there is such a parallel. And again, I think that Tolkien was getting quite a bit of the Sophianic narrative, but it got told through influences of both Catholicism, and of course Catholicism is laced with pagan concepts. Okay, I saw that I was buffering, so I got quiet for a second. I mean, of all the various and again, the Tolkien is best known for his Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, but the Lord of the Rings. And the Lord of the Rings is a fiction-based work based on the Silmarillion, which is not fiction-based. It was him peering into the shamanic world, and within the capability of his understanding, picking up a creation story, which is the Ainu Lindale, the beginning of the Silmarillion, and basically coming up with a creation story that is far more wholesome than other creation stories, with the exception of the Sophianic narrative. So getting back to the Sophianic narrative, and then the things that happen to the Anthropos after having been on the earth for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, and the deep understanding that their shamans had come up with, and the fact that when you're able to look back, you can see that the primary shamans were women. They had the most natural ability. And there were plenty of men who demonstrated it as well, but there was a certain understanding that getting away from the intellect, or the more physically based expression of our energies, almost as a birthright, resided in women. So then we have what I call the insertions. It's really interesting when one, I mean, especially since so much Greek wording is used to explain much of the Sophianic narrative. So that kind of puts us in the middle of the Greeks. And I find that important because, so that's why very often what I have done is, okay, where do things start getting corrupt? And the most primitive creation or you know, kind of cosmology of the Greeks was simply Gaia, earth, and Uranos, sky. In many ways, I can parse that out to Sophia and the Pleroma. Kind of neat, very, you know, shorthand, but concise in its shorthand. And in that very simple setting, it's pretty clean. Gaia and Uranus, without any further interpretation. Just kind of like letting that sit. That, the way it is, that very simple setting is clean for me. What happens is that the myth telling starts to build a history. Please understand I'm saying a history, which again is patriarchal narrative. And they do a couple of things once they start fleshing it out. One of the things is that the kind of what we could call almost like the male aspect of this very simple yin-yang Uranus Gaia setting is that they start telling stories about the children that Uranus and Gaia have. This is where the fuckery starts immediately. And they fuck with both the yin and the yang aspect of it. They start, the funny thing is they kind of start with, by, to me, turning Uranus into the demiurge. How did they do this? They introduce vanity. How did they introduce vanity? Well, as that myth breaks out from that simple setting of Uranus and Gaia, they have them producing children, and I guess it's the Takaris or something. It's, you know, they have like 50 heads and 100 hands. And the Cyclops. These are kind of like the early, these are what are claimed by to me what I would call the archontic myth makers into the original simple Gaia Uranus setting. And apparently what they do, here's what I mean by vanity. What they posit into the story, what they insert into the story, is that Uranus was horrified by these beings that Gaia had birthed. These, you know, 50-headed, 100-handed beasts and the Cyclops with one eye. So you can see the vanity. Okay, so here's the whole thing. It's like, ooh, you know, you're birthing these ugly things. It makes me look bad. Okay, so there's your vanity. Where appearances are important. That's the demiurge. That's old Yali himself. This is the insertion of Yaldabaoth into a clean concept. So again, they insert the vanity. And then they take that same thing and then they take that same vanity and impose it on Gaia, where she's offended, talk about bringing it up to times, by his rejection of what she was doing. You know, like basically, you know, the whole thing is like he's contributing some, you know, some form of seed to her, and then she's birthing these beings. Hello, Fernan. She's birthing these beings that he is horrified by. These are the archontic insertions into a pristine, very simple, little elucidation, but the primordial cosmology of the ancient Greeks. There was Gaia the mother, and there was you know, Uranus, kind of like a distant, you know, had some agency in the sky. And they start inserting these negative archontic qualities that now have quite a bit of expression in humanity. So okay, so they kind of, to me, what they do is they take Uranus and they start demiurging him by giving him demiurgic qualities. Namely, in to me the most glaring one is this vanity. They do. So again, and I really believe these confabulations, are just confabulations, like the Hecatontaires, I think that's the name, and the Cyclops. And so they kind of so what they do is they set up enmity between the genders. I mean, the story barely breaks out, and already the enmity between the genders, which is an archontic insertion, shows up. Uranus is disgusted with the offspring of his quote-unquote cosmic wife. And she's offended that he's horrified. Do you see how fucked up this is getting, as what I call the breaking out of the Uranus-Gaia myth? Then there's other insertions. The Titans, Kronos and that crew, now get inserted. In other words, to me, the seven basic sky gods, the archontic beings, the ones who represent the other seven planets, get inserted into the story. But in many ways, what it is they get inserted to Gaia's womb because they posit them as her offspring. And they're not. They're insertions into the story. And one of the things that bugs the shit out of me in those insertions is it allows them to conflate what I think is probably one of the greatest original daughters, if not the actual agency of our mother herself, into the story. And that would be Hecate. Hecate, in the corruption, in the insertion, in the archontification of the most primordial Greek myth, is posited as a Titan. And if you read the mythic stories about her, it's very clear that she seemed to have allegiance only to herself, even though she picked sides in some of the fuckery that went on between the Titans and the Olympians. It's very clear she represented only herself. What's also very clear is how in high respect she was held by these other pantheons. After all, and to me it also makes sense because she was there first. I really feel like in certain ways Hecate is one of the true daughters of Sophia. And in many ways her true daughters are all women because they were done without a male consort. So they have to be a form of parthenogenesis. Hello, Hans. I hope this isn't getting too deep or crazy for people, but this is what I was moved to get into tonight. So Hecate, who I feel like with all these different beings that they have coming out of Gaia's womb, Hecate is the one who represents a true emanation from our Earth Mother, from Gaia Sophia. And that the these horrible, the hecatontaires and the Cyclops, although, I'm not saying that there's no place for Cyclops, but this whole, again, these creating of monsters that Uranus could not like. So again, in creating enmity, and then, creating the offense of Gaia that her sky husband doesn't like. So then we have the breakout story of the Titans and Kronos. And I don't know whether Kronos is Yaldabaoth himself or his head archon. And they kind of, and we should, and again, names should never be forgotten. Kronos really implies time. Time in a linear fashion. But I want to stay, I don't want to get too far off on the archons, the Titans, and then the Olympians. But we have Hecate emerging from that milieu, and again, this is how viruses ride on healthy material. In other words, I consider Hecate to be an absolute organic emanation or energetic emanation of Gaia Sophia. And then what the archontic people do is they populate this natural emanation with their insertions and try to create this kind of cosmic sacred family. And then I don't want to get too far off on Hecate, but just kind of this breakout. But anyway, so then what happens is in that story, and where it really goes south, and you can see it tying into the biblical narrative. You can see where one feeds the other. The biblical narrative being the kind of the coup de grace of what these patriarchal development narratives. What happens is, because Uranus doesn't like her children, she conspires. So now what the story does is it turns Gaia into a conspirator with Kronos to castrate or emasculate, and therefore remove from a viable position as the Sky Father, Uranus. So basically, this is kind of like, to me, the Greek equivalent of Eve biting the apple. The conspiratorial, the thinking only of themselves trip, the guilt trip being laid on the female gender, and even at the cosmic level of the Earth. So anyway, that story continues to unfold, or excrete is a better word for the unfolding of this story. And So she conspires, turns into a traitor to her quote-unquote husband with her son to put her son up as king. And right away, this is a patriarchal thing. Succession of the kings. So you can see in these early mythos how they're setting up for what they were beginning a narrative of, first of all, male primacy, patriarchy, the concept of kings, succession of kings, all the shit that is holding us back right now. All the patriarchal shit, which is what brings me back to kind of what started this, was women and the patriarchy. Women who know that they're done with the patriarchy and understanding that many of these women who are anti-patriarchy are living within a patriarchal cosmos. And if they're atheists, they're still patriarchal because, you know, they're some form of Darwin and Marx. Men. So there's really no getting away that a big, to me, one of the concepts that women, I mean, men have to do it equally, but because to me women are, you know, they're the ones who are like, we're matriarchy and the patriarchy sucks. I agree with them. But you can't be calling for matriarchy while you still embrace patriarchal cosmology. I mean, energetically, it's off. You're supporting one thing while you're screaming against it. You're holding it up. It's a support of that system. That's right, Foxadre. So one of the things is women. Time to find out about the Sophianic narrative. Equally for men, but again, women are the natural exponents of let's get done with the patriarchy. But they're gonna have to clean up the cosmology. Now, one of the interesting things, I think I kind of made that case a little bit, and it probably could be expanded, but I don't want to get lost in it. I don't want this to be a one-topic monologue. I think there was a fair amount of exposition there, and for now, unless I kind of circle back to it, but I see there's another key word I wrote for myself to speak about tonight, and that word is memory. In the Casey material and the Steiner material, when they're kind of speaking about the development of the human species on the Earth, we don't need to call it a planet, it's the Earth. Don't need to define a shape, it's where we live, it's the Earth. That before the development of like, let's say, left brain dominant thinking, and it seems that there was a period where there was a lot of right brain domination, and my own take is that you don't want either side to be dominant. Similarly with the genders, you don't want either side dominant. You want V8 action, V8 engine, where both cylinders, both sides of an array are contributing together in a synergistic fashion. But it appears that the initial setting, because the initial setting was the optimal setting while the intellectual capacity was developing. And the original setting, which was largely like right-brained, was memory. The ability to remember, to share in the memory of our ancestors. Not only to share in the memory as it passes down through genes, but to tap into the morphogenetic field, and also the fact that in the natural setting, we don't have heavens and hells. When you pass from your body, you go into the dream time. You go into that other space. You are still around. And so you kind of have the right brain gives you access to your ancestors that have passed but are still present energetically, the memory of their accomplishments, the do's and don'ts that come through the genetic memory, and then the fact that I think Rupert Sheldrake has a very cogent concept of morphogenetic fields for the various species, where you could, an organic, to use an archontic term, the cloud, where all your stuff is stored on the cloud. Well, each species has its own field, a repository for all the mistakes and accomplishments of a given species. The memory of what has worked and what has not worked. So memory is a very important part. And so what goes on, what kind of emerges in both the Steiner and Casey tellings of the development of the human species is that before the intellect developed, the accomplishments, and you can see the great accomplishments of the ancient world were through the ability to recall, to call again what was known, memory. Part of the patriarchal paradigm is very left-brained. Your knowledge is based on what you learned, and especially in the modern world, from books and not from memory. In many ways, the creation of books was to supplement a failing memory. As memory was being destroyed by this pulling into the other part of this, the left dominant brain, books were absolutely necessary, or else everything would be forgotten. But as those books were written, corruptions were inserted, and only those with the ability to recall before the writings would know the difference and what were errors in these written narratives. So even in the Casey and Steiner material, we keep on getting back to, in many ways, a golden age that preceded the Archontic age. More like Archontic ages. And in the breakout myth, as I kind of broke it down, of the Gaia Uranus, what I consider a certain amount of pristine simplicity there. And then the breaking out of the narrative of that simple setting, with the insertions of titans, conflations of what I consider to be true representations in one way or another of Sophia herself through Hecate. At that time, in in our joint development and her awakening process. Again, from the moment that these myths start, because these are the ones that have been preserved by history. See, this is the stuff that has been allowed to remain around. If you're following New Earth, you know that Scaliger and another guy kind of took all the ancient texts and corrected them and put them into a modern form, put them into a timeline. So all of the ones that were not scrubbed all feed into and create a fertile ground for the narrative that would emerge in the Old Testament. The tightening of the noose. In the older kind of mythos, those other ones, we see the tying of the noose. We see each wrap of the noose wrappings being formed. And then when the biblical narrative shows up, we see that noose get tightened, real tight. And the extermination of the ancient world begins. The memory holders, the men and women of wisdom, the traditions, what was sacred, destroyed. And we find ourselves here. But fortunately, owing to the labor and diligence and the intended purpose of John Lamb Lash, we now have the Sophianic narrative. And it is knowing and living within the Sophianic narrative that has enabled me to look at all these other stories, make sense of them, see their purpose, and their purpose is insertion, intrusion, and poisoning. Takeover, domination. And it's why on occasion, and I've done less of it, and I'm not going to go into any deep thing, but why I have problems with the wholesomeness of modern magical systems, like Hermetic systems. Not alchemy, but the Hermetic systems. Because they're all patriarchal based. The other thing that gets corrupted is that the agency is removed from Earth and placed in this thing called heaven. And heaven was a concept, or hell. But let's say there wasn't a hell. Let's just say that everyone, when they died, went to heaven. The very concept, even if something that sounds as benevolent as heaven, is a removal of our ancestors from our ability to communicate with them and maintain a dynamic relationship with them, whether they're in a body or not. What modern people and our quantified thinking they call it ancestor worship. It wasn't worship. It was a continuing dialogue. And for particularly accomplished ancestors, there was veneration. There was an act of remembering these accomplishments that we may hold to them and not lose these accomplishments. So even without a hell to scare people, because fear is the big motivator of the vain demiurge, course, that fear is inserted from his own fear, because vanity is basically the fear of not looking good. So even without the insertion of hell, even with what would look like, oh, gee, well, heaven sounds like a nice place. No, it's a taking of our ancestors offline, taking them out of the loop, removing them. It also disrupts what was known was the gnosis of all the ancient people, at least the ones who had some decent shamans in their group, of reincarnation, the continuation. And that very often when we had more traditional societies that stayed on a land, the land and the people, not with this, and the sovereignty was of the people, not with a sovereign. That ancestors would very often continue within their own people. Some people would go off into other peoplings and genomes, but largely there was a lot of staying within, and that's one of the things that the concept of heaven breaks up. It is the removal. First of all, it takes away. It doesn't work with the concept of reincarnation, and it takes the intelligence that is still there with us, but this not in a body, and packs it away behind some pearly gates. Gates are gates, whether they have pearls on them or not. And not only do they prevent entry, they prevent exit as well. Sunshine on Sophia with the Sophianic narrative, we don't need to. I don't think we need to rewrite the old patriarch. We need to dispose of them. They're garbage. I mean, I tend to throw my garbage out, not restructure it. There's no reason to hold on to them. They're garbage. They're rotting garbage. They have rotted our psyche. They have rotted our world. They're shit. They're toxic. Now, it must be said that a lot of wisdom from the ancient world probably occupies great portions of these myths, because that is the food, that is the wholesome food that a poisoner needs to work their poison craft. Poison is inserted into food or drink. So a lot of, the Old Testament has a lot of food and drink in there, lifted from the older traditions. Because without it, there would be no place to insert the poison. And that's what a lot of people protect. They'll protect them. Oh, but there's great wisdom in there. Yeah, but what's in it? What's hidden in it? And where is this the only place you go? No, you can find that wisdom all over the place, and especially in indigenous teachings. So to me, there's zero need to keep that trash around. But while we have it, to me, what we're seeing in these novellas is the insertion and intrusion of a anthropic mimic species. The archons have no creativity. They can only mimic. And they can twist. And sometimes those twists look like creativity. They're just twists. But of course they have our creativity to mine. But again, it's not their creativity. It's ideas they lift from the anthropos. And one of the ways they interact with the anthropos, and have been interacting with the anthropos for some thousands of years, is through Western magical traditions. Western magical traditions are a setup for the anthropos to interact with the archons, so that we can be milked. And so what the archons learn from one section of humanity, another section of humanity might not know these things, so then they can go, oh, we have this wisdom for you, that they lifted from another section of humanity. So the Western magical traditions are an interface system for the anthropos to interact with its adversary. For our brains to be picked. And then, again, one group of brains can be fed to another group that might not have gotten there yet. And then what they learned is here. And so they're able to kind of cross-share our own wisdom with different sections of us so that they appear wise. And at the same time, they're able to, once they kind of get that respect, they're able to insert their own twistings. And always pulling us away from the earth. The whole thing of these narratives is pulling things towards the sky, towards heaven, where the agency resides above and not within the earth itself. The agency that we are concerned with on earth is the earth herself. She has the full support of the pleroma and the originator, big time. And there's nothing that they have that she doesn't have through being a part of them. In other words, you don't have to stray. You don't have to go other places to get what you need. And the Western systems all pull us away from the earth. And that is my problem with them. Not with the practitioners, with the systems. Just like I have a deep, abiding disgust with the monotheisms, and that includes Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism, if any way, it might even be kind of the beginnings of the good cop, bad cop of the demiurge himself, where they, Zoroaster puts the Ahura Mazda as the good one and Ahriman as the bad one. It's good cop, bad cop, and it's patriarchal. Where'd it go? I actually have stayed in the chat, and it's moved me a little bit around, but in many ways I allowed those things to move me because I didn't want, like I said, I wanted to be a little broad. Okay, right, practitioners. So although I hold in great disgust the monotheisms and Zoroastrianism and all that sky god and good cop, bad cop in heaven and all the rest of that shit, I don't have any particular dislike for the practitioners. They're caught up in it. They were born into it. And access to good material is not easy to find. To tell people that probably To me, the cleanest and most pristine source of the ancient gnosis and knowledge and our mysteries is found on metahistory.org, written by 170 now, a man in his 70s, John Lamb Lash. Some people have, I heard at least one person refer to him as a middle-aged man. I refer to somebody that's at his age to be an elder. I hope there's still respect for elders, and that's a very, again, that's something that even the Archontic people have tried to hold on, is the elders. Although it's usually a bunch of guys. So the fact, that we're born into these archontified systems, and right now it looks like that if you're going to get out, if you're born in one of the indigenous traditions, well, then you might, be able to navigate through their traditions, depending on how well they've been able to uphold them with the onslaughts that they've had. But if most of the people in the Western world do not come from an indigenous or background, we come from a more modern background, and for them it's almost makes more sense for something that embraces the whole Earth, which is the Gaian narrative, the Sophianic narrative, also known as the fallen goddess scenario. So again, when I come out against Western traditions as just the Western magical traditions as just more of the patriarchy, I'm not speaking about practitioners or people who feel comfortable there. I'm not going after people. I'm going after systems. I'm going after things that are not flesh and blood. Practitioners are flesh and blood. They're fellow human animals. I'm not after them. I'm after the systems that corrupt human animals. And I would ask any of the humans out there who are part of a system that they are like with, please do not take my assailing of the system personally. It's not delivered personally. That's not the intent. Be who you are and be fine with, let us be fine with who we are, and not overly identify with something that isn't human, which are these systems. Human management systems. So I think I might be done here. I kind of, if I could reinsert into some of the earlier parts of my dialogue or monologue, I could probably pick it up again. But then I think I might be, I'd be picking it up, but also there's a lot to this, and I wanted to do what I did, was really maybe touch on topics and points of topics where people listening go, oh, I never really considered that. Where the fact that no matter what creation story one reads, in the background there's always a humanity hiding. Again, in the Garden of Eden, when Cain is going out into the greater world, he's going out to a populated world. Who are those people? Who are those human animals? Those were the anthropines. Those are what are revealed in the Gaian, in the Sophianic narrative. No, that's a little bit, Mad Finger, that's kind of that's very Telestic. Yes, I am just getting started. But at some point, that light will certainly be have greater applicability. Hello, Julie. So, whether I said now, like I said, the Sumerian or Anunnaki creation myth, as told by Sitchin, is so. I mean, it's such a tiny piece. There's been great scholarship on the thousands of cuneiform clay tablets that have been found, and in my opinion, the one just from his left brain, Anton Parks. But Anton Parks, like Tolkien and like Jung, had an experience where he went into an alternative reality to get a lot of his material. And he wrote a book, The Ages of Uros, which is quite involved, and I'm staying away from that. I'm staying with his simpler stuff of decoding what was found in what he calls his Eden book, which has to do with the creation of something by the Anunnaki. But what is very clear, just like in the biblical narrative, it's very clear that there are lots of human animals on the planet that were not created in the Garden of Eden. And since we have that, it's just like, so what was this thing? And I mean the word thing that was created in the Garden of Eden. And in the Sumerian text, again, in the Sumerian text, their first gardens were ruined by the humans. And then they create a being, a thing. So no matter, no matter where we go, looming large, if you have eyes to see, is an extant human species population on the earth before any of this other shit begins. My take on these stories, especially when you have the offspring of these Garden of Eden things being told to be fruitful and multiply. Sounds like viral expansion to me. Go out and infect the earth. That's what I hear, and be fruitful and multiply, coming from the, as a quote from the Demiurge. Go out and pollute the genome of the earth. Reduce their capabilities by bringing your inferior genetics into their line. Once again, more poison being inserted into the wholesome product of the earth, which is the anthropos. I did some study because I had said some things about Cro-Magnon man, who was probably, again, these are scientific designations. Cro-Magnon man. In every way like the modern human, except his brain was bigger. And although quackademia and its anthropologists are saying that its height was about modern human, on more than a couple occasions I've seen where it's looking like Cro-Magnon was more like 7 feet. And then in fact, this race of giants that gets put down as wicked was probably who we were. And that this diminutive genetic disease-laden, brain capacity compromised thing was set out upon the human animal to exterminate those who had the old knowledge, to kill the women who had bred and could breed, kill the men, the wisdom keepers, and they'd take those women who had not known a man, in other words, pre-puberty, and then take them, of course, as slaves and inseminate them and corrupt the original genome. I do believe there were different sizes. I agree with that, Hans. It makes sense, because when you look into the natural world, you'll see expressions of a species in different sizes. So I totally get that. But what was clear was that this Cro-Magnon man was more robust, more physically impressive, and also had a bigger brain capacity. So this kind of basically, this telestic streaming was for me how I've been able to take some of this extra material, in a dark, and some of it coming through the readings of Edgar Cayce and Rudolf Steiner, the work of Rudolf Steiner, and saying, okay, I'm coming with my Sophianic narrative. That's my gnosis. So when I take that gnosis into these other stories, what do I come away with? First of all, I come away with that the narrative is pristine and intact. It's a very wholesome narrative. But then to me, it also answers some questions of, why are we such a mess? And beyond just the psychological infection created by the patriarchal cosmologies, but that it seems that besides this mind virus, it's looking to me like there was also a somatic or flesh analog to go with the mind virus. And that analog is the being that we read about being created in the Genesis telling and in the Sumerian tellings of their creating of the Lulu. So anyway, I'm going to leave it there. That's going to be my telestic transmission for tonight. I recommend, if you have not exposed yourself or taken a trip through the Sophianic narrative, that one does so, and one goes to metahistory.org and looks it up on the thing and on the tree there, and find out what's being transmitted there. All right, so that's it for me. And I'm going to hit my stop streaming button right now.